Mihawk vs. Shanks is one of the most controversial topics in the One Piece community. The fandom is divided, not just over which of these former rivals is stronger, but over whether it even matters. Some people are happy to argue power scaling as long as one person disagrees with them. For others, power scaling is a nuisance when the characters and themes are what really matter. But the two sides don't need to be separate. The question of who is stronger reveals more than you'd think about who they are, and the answer can change the themes of the story. So today, I want to look at the subject from a new angle, an angle that will help us understand and answer the debate and connect back to One Piece's themes. To do so, we have to talk about power scaling, games, why Zoro is a swordsman, what Mihawk and Shanks represent, and how power scaling is both inherently flawed and a part of how One Piece conveys its messages. Only by combining those can we seek the truth about Mihawk and Shanks. But first, be aware. Notorious pirate Buggy the Clown has fallen into a well. It is very dark and scary. Subscribe to the channel so that we can mail him a ladder and help him escape. And like the video if you instead want to place a large stone atop the well and trap him. Mihawk vs. Shanks is a tired topic. The discourse has been done to death. But by giving the debate a close examination, we can look for a new angle. That can help us understand not just who is stronger, but what that means. First, let's clarify the term strength. By strength, I mean the general quality that allows you to consistently win fights, through a combination of raw strength, skill, haki, and anything else. I'm not talking about who has better muscles. With that out of the way, let's review the common arguments around Mihawk and Shanks. Both of them have enough feats to confirm their top-tier status, but not enough for a definite comparison. A lot of clashes, not a lot of full fights. The lack of evidence forces us to go off of implications. So if they were comparable as rivals, then Shanks should be weaker without an arm. But there's no way to prove who grew more since. Emperors are above warlords, but those are just labels. And Mihawk recently became something of an emperor himself, the power behind the clown. And the stronger of two rivals is often 1 centimeter taller than the other. That is evidence for Shanks. But Mihawk has a smoking gun. I mean, he won't use a gun, he's a swordsman, but that's just it. Mihawk is the world's strongest swordsman, and Shanks has a sword. If Shanks is stronger, then the story has lied, and in a way that devalues Zoro's dream. The possibility that Shanks is a better swordsman than Mihawk is off the table. In this video, we won't be considering it. Most of the ways around this are awkward. Some claim that Shanks is a haki man, but haki is part of swordsmanship. Some argue he's stronger but less skilled, and that's just even sillier. But Mr. Morge made a better case in a great video 5 years ago. He argued that the world's strongest swordsman must beat anyone in a sword duel, but can lose to people with other powers. Winning with a devil fruit doesn't count. So if the story reveals that haki masters can shoot beams, then Shanks can win. The problem is, this solution is a what if. Haki beams are not real, and may never be. For now, it's just a theory. But I still agree with that video's logic. To be a stronger swordsman, you have to win with swordsmanship. Enel isn't a better swordsman if he holds a sword while zapping Zoro. The issue is if our only criteria for swordsmen are the sword and not using powers. That leaves us wondering if haki can somehow disqualify Shanks. But I think there's more to swordsmanship than that, because to me, Shanks doesn't feel like a swordsman. He doesn't feel like the same type of fighter as Mihawk or Zoro. It could just be a feeling. But if something is causing that feeling, then that something could allow him to beat Mihawk. I'm not here to argue that Shanks is stronger. We can't know unless we see them fight. But I want to see if it's possible for him to be stronger, without contradicting Mihawk's title. Not with theories or Haki Man nonsense, but by seeing if Shanks truly diverges from swordsmanship. To explore this, we need to reframe our view of swordsmen. We see swordsmen as a category of fighter, where we give the strongest one a crown. But swordsmanship is more than that. Swordsmanship is a fighting style, a philosophy, and most of all, a game. When I call swordsmanship a game, I don't mean it's casual, Friday night fun. I mean that swordsmanship has rules. In the book The Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia, the philosopher Bernard Suits defines playing a game as follows. To play a game is to attempt to achieve a specific state of affairs, using only means permitted by rules, where the rules prohibit use of more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where the rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. For example, sumo wrestling is a game. When Luffy challenges Urashima, his goal is to knock him out of the ring. The rules permit Luffy to push or throw, but not to strike the ears or eyes. Those would make it easier for him to push Arashima out, but it wouldn't count as winning. The rules are what turn the act of pushing Arashima out into winning the sumo match. In the book Games, Agency as Art, the philosopher T. Wen puts it like this: by itself, getting a ball through a stupid little basket has no independent value on its own. I don't go to the basketball court late at night with a ladder and spend hours passing the ball through the hoop. Getting the ball through the hoop is worthless outside of the constraints and structure of the game. Beating Mihawk is nothing on its own. You have to win with swords and can't just poison him in his sleep. Although, considering Mihawk's bathroom doesn't have any toilet paper, it's a miracle he hasn't already died from an infection. But Zoro does bathe only once a week, so maybe bad hygiene makes a swordsman stronger? That aside, we have a goal, permitted means, and prohibited means. And with those, fighting in and winning a sword duel is made possible. The activity is created by the constraints and structure of swordsmanship. In other words, by the rules. Framing swordsmanship as a game will help us in a few ways. It clarifies what the world's strongest swordsman is, shows how Shanks can beat Mihawk, and teaches us about Zoro. The world's strongest swordsman is an ambiguous title. It's unclear if you can't have powers at all, or if you just have to primarily use a sword. There is no one correct way to define it, but the rules provide a useful angle. Rather than say who is a swordsman, they define what actions are swordsmanship. You can win a fight however you want, but to win a sword duel, you have to follow the rules. Non-swordsmen can win a match if they follow the rules, and the strongest swordsman is the one who can win against all others. But if Shanks can only win by breaking the rules, then he can't win the match. He doesn't get the title, because the hardest possible sword duel is still against Mihawk. I'm not saying you have to agree with this view. It's all subjective, and it's fine if you just don't vibe with this framework. But I want to see where this angle can point us. Because for each new rule, we can check if Shanks would break it, and if that would help him win. The rule against other powers wasn't enough, since Hakimen aren't real, but we can look for more. But the goal is not to disqualify him with arbitrary rules when everyone still considers him a swordsman. The rules should describe swordsmanship fairly. Shanks' actions have to genuinely not be swordsmanship. So to make sure the rules are accurate, we have to build them with evidence. And luckily, One Piece directly tells us what it considers the rules. After all, wounds on the back are a swordsman's shame. Swordsmen do not turn their backs. They face danger and never run away. Zoro and Mihawk confirm it. More than anyone else, those two demonstrate what true swordsmanship is. And other characters show us what swordsmanship isn't. During Wano, King disarms Zoro with a serrated blade and then punches him. And Zoro says, "You never called yourself a swordsman." King has a sword, but his actions are not swordsmanship. These scenes confirm that in One Piece, swordsmanship is more than just using a sword. Fighting in the wrong way can disqualify you. By studying characters like Zoro and King, we can identify the rules. In response, the rules will show us who Zoro is. The rules you choose to follow say things about who you are. And the rules of swordsmanship only define who the strongest is because people like Zoro want to prove themselves. And each rule will say something about what doing that means. Once we have the rules, we can loop back to Shanks and tie it all together. But for now, it's time for Zoro and the 5 rules of swordsmanship. We already know Rule 1, fight with a sword. No using other weapons or powers. Swords are required by definition, and most true swordsmen don't have devil fruits. But Rule 1 also limits the body. King shows he's not a swordsman in part by punching. Kabaji kicks Zoro's wound, and he's all about not using real swordplay. And Hachi, who doesn't understand true swordsmanship either, uses a body slam. By disallowing those things, Rule 1 equalizes the match. When there are no advantages, winning can actually say who's stronger. To prove yourself a stronger swordsman, you need to outsword the opponent. This rule looks simple, but looks can be deceiving. What exactly is a sword? How are they shaped? Are Helmeppo's Kukri's swords? Killer's punishers? Killer's scythes? I would say no, but Zoro uses a scythe in a 3-sword style attack. Is that allowed? Comment whether you think a scytheman can be the strongest swordsman. Surely the 12 supreme grade blades are all swords, but they include Whitebeard's Naginata. Kaku claims to use 4-sword style with his Tempest kicks, and I'm drawing the line. Legs are not swords. Unless you're Mr. 1 or Shiki. This seemingly binary rule was actually a spectrum. And so are other powers. Some of them just aren't allowed. Gravity is not swordsmanship, even if it did defeat Kuina, so Fujitora can't use it in a duel. But what about Kinemon? His fruit doesn't affect combat, but it would if he fought in a blizzard. He'd be warm while his opponent is cold. So how cold does the weather have to be for his power to disqualify him? Brook's power makes him lighter, so is that unfair? And I don't even know if Mr. 1 is a swordsman. There are always going to be edge cases, for all of the rules. But it still means something to follow them perfectly. Rule 1 is also about commitment. Zoro has the resolve to stick to his weapons. And if you have the capacity to commit to the sword, you have the capacity to commit to more. The rules dictate not just what to fight with, but what a fight is. Swordsmanship is tested in duels, and duels are 1 versus 1. That is a rule 2, and that is rule 2. You have to fight alone. Zoro always does, but most One Piece fights are duels anyway. The importance of duels to swordsmen in particular is shown in Zoro vs. Mihawk. Luffy holds Johnny and Yosaku back from helping, even as he wants to help too. If any of them did help, then even if Zoro won, it wouldn't prove he was stronger. But it's not just about giving up advantages. Swordsmanship is individualistic. Zoro isn't just trying to prove that it can be done, he's trying to prove that he can do it. So a swordsman has to be self-reliant. That's why Mihawk has no crew, and lives alone in a gloomy castle with only Perona and the Humandrils to talk to. That is his grind set. And that's why Zoro wants to handle Kuma alone, both in fending him off and in accepting Luffy's pain. By defining matches this way, Rule 2 allows the game to test individual qualities. But to make sure that strength is the quality being tested, the rules also need to limit how you fight. Zoro's first real fight is about the difference between swordsmanship and fighting with a sword, as Kabaji combines swordplay with gimmicks. Kabaji's gimmicks do break Rule 1, but the real issue is the dishonesty. By surprising, misdirecting, and hiding from Zoro, they withhold information. In response, Zoro says, "Enough circus tricks, he's using real swordplay." Kabaji even agrees with him. Tricks are not real swordsmanship. Rule 3 is to fight with honor. This is more vague than Rules 1 and 2. You can't define sword duels without the swords and the duels, but the line between honor and trickery is blurry. Zoro is honorable and straightforward. He announces his challenges to opponents and considers indirect tactics against Pika before deciding to just charge in. He even calls Pika out for troubling those on the straight and narrow. But to see the more specific ways in which trickery is prohibited, we have to look at context. Consider the following cases. King uses a serrated blade to disarm Zoro, Rebecca lures Luffy into a trap, Kanjuro fakes his identity, Ohm uses traps, and Hyozo poisons his blades. Each of these tricksters already breaks other rules. Besides how some of them have devil fruits, King punches, Kanjuro is swordless, Ohm's weapon is barely a sword, plus he has a dog, Rebecca's weapon is literally not a sword as it has no edge, and Hyozo was caught doping. The story associates improper swordsmen with lies and deceit to show us that trickery is not swordsmanship. Now, I did just list a bunch of examples without going into much detail. If you want to hear me elaborate on why each one counts and why they indicate that Rule 3 exists, you can subscribe to my Patreon for an exclusive video of my extended thoughts. I discuss the specifics of all the evidence I talk about in this video, additional examples and why I didn't include them, and various tangents and other lines of argument that I thought were interesting but I couldn't fit in this video without making it 2 hours long. In particular, I'll talk about additional rules of swordsmanship that I think are just as interesting but for various reasons just didn't fit here. The Patreon is $2 a month, but important note, I am only charging patrons during months where I am working on videos. After this one, I'm back to being on break from YouTube, and it'll be a while before I can return. If that inconsistency makes you not want to commit to being a patron, you can also buy the Extended Thoughts video individually. I wanted to set its price to $2, but it's $3 because that's the minimum that Patreon allows. Alright, now back to Rule 3. In addition to using poison, Hyozo also attacks from behind. Ambushes are arguably forbidden by the line "wounds on the back are a swordsman's shame." The usual reading forbids fleeing and getting hit on the back, but it can also mean it's shameful to strike someone on the back, as that means they were either fleeing or unaware. By facing forward, Zoro protects Mihawk from having to act dishonorably. But there's a reason people use trickery. Even though it's dishonorable, it can be your only chance to win. Kabaji's tricks made the fight closer. They gave him more of a chance than if he followed the rules. But that can't be allowed in the game, because swordsmanship is meant to prove who's stronger. Tricks don't guarantee success, but they increase variance. Mihawk is probably not gonna let himself get poisoned, but every time someone tries, there's a chance it works. If poison was allowed, then someone who wins against Mihawk might have been stronger, but also might have just gotten lucky. Proof of strength becomes unreliable. And if you can't prove who's stronger, there can't be a world's strongest swordsman. So Rule 3 forbids anything that lets the weak beat the strong. I'm not judging tricksters. Rebecca had noble intentions, and I love how Usopp fights. The weak have the right to do whatever works against the strong, but swordsmen don't want to win no matter what. They want to prove their strength. Winning with trickery doesn't give that. And this is why Zoro always fights with honor. Except, of course, all the times where he doesn't. Zoro is not a perfect rule follower. I have been lying to you. But Zoro has lied too. Against Bram, he pretends his goggles block light. Bram sees through it because Zoro can't lie like Usopp, but he tries. Zoro breaks Rule 2 when fighting Oars and during Roof Piece. He breaks Rule 1 by using his hands against Miss Monday and fighting with his hands and his Sanji in the Groggy Ring. And he tells King he might end up biting his throat out. He says that because King is not a swordsman. None of these opponents are. If they break the rules, then Zoro can too. A bishop doesn't have to move diagonally on a Monopoly board. The rules don't apply outside the game. Zoro doesn't have to follow the rules in the Groggy Ring because that is literally a different game. This all seems nice, but it creates a problem. Most swordsmen break some rules. By this logic, Zoro can break them in most of his fights. Even worse, he could discount his losses. Losing as a swordsman only exists inside the game. That's why it's okay that Zoro lost to Kuma. But what about someone who is generally a swordsman but also breaks the rules? If Zoro lost to Kabaji, he could complain that Kabaji broke the rules, so the loss doesn't count. That would be insane cope. Zoro fans would burn their books. Someone who says that will never be the world's strongest swordsman. And luckily, Zoro would never say that. Instead, he says that he cannot lose against anyone who calls himself a swordsman. Even if they break the rules, he still has to win. Rule 4 is to be ready for anything. Ambushes are against the rules, but Zoro is always on guard, even when drunk or asleep. Fighting with help is forbidden, but Zoro handles the Nyaban brothers and Killer and Gyukimaru. And powers are forbidden, but Zoro constantly beats Devil Fruit users. If you don't follow Rule 4, you end up like T-Bone. Captain T-Bone hates crooked swordplay so much that he only strikes in straight lines. He's ready to fight honorably, but he's not ready for anything. He gets completely bamboozled by Sanji's trickery. Rule 4 isn't needed in a proper duel. There, everyone follows the rules anyway. But that's not the only game of swordsmanship. There's the oppositional multiplayer game of duels, and there's the single-player player versus environment game. When Zoro overcomes opponents while following the rules, he's winning at swordsmanship even if they weren't playing. He's still achieving a goal using permitted means and not prohibited means. Losing to a rule breaker doesn't prove you're a worse swordsman. They didn't win with swordsmanship. But if your swordsmanship was good enough, you could have won anyway. And winning with a disadvantage still proves that you're better. That's why Zoro follows the rules against anyone who's reasonably a swordsman, and only breaks them when it obviously doesn't count. At its logical extreme, this might seem like it implies that the rules don't matter, because if breaking them is okay, then you can't disqualify anyone ever. But that's not quite the point of Rule 4. Every rule is a spectrum, and there's already no objective place to draw the line of who counts as a swordsman or not. Rule 4 didn't make that the case, it just acknowledges it. It says that if someone is obviously not a swordsman, then sure, Zoro can do whatever he wants. But if it's at all ambiguous, then just call them a swordsman and beat them. No cheap cop-outs. This rule isn't for defining perfect matches. This rule is how a true swordsman like Zoro holds himself to a standard. Rule 4 is really about taking responsibility. After getting captured in Thriller Bark, Zoro blames himself for letting his guard down. When he gets injured by Killer while dodging Gyukimaru, he doesn't blame Hiyori for luring Killer there. He blames his own lack of skill. To Zoro, failure is never because of the enemy. Failure is because he was too weak. Swordsmen want to prove their strength in general, not just for the sake of the game. If you truly want to test yourself, then you can't make any excuses. You can't blame your loss on weapons, allies, powers, or even the opponent. And without those, all that's left is to master the self. The most iconic moment in Zoro vs. Mihawk is the bit about wounds in the back. But my favorite part is a little earlier, when Mihawk stabs Zoro's chest and Zoro refuses to step back. One step back and his dreams are shattered. He prefers death to defeat. The day Zoro decided to be the world's greatest swordsman, he gave himself up for dead. Samurai in Wano chant Tsunachi, or surrender your name and be as a child. Those who value themselves too much stop taking risks. If 1% of your mind is on self-preservation, you can't give 100% to your goal. But that internal conflict resolves if you consider yourself dead. If Zoro retreats, his odds of survival are decent. He can live those wounds. If he fights on, the odds of victory might be 0. Even if he values victory higher, retreat offers greater expected value, since its odds are so much better. But if he considers himself dead, survival is worth 0. Retreat gives nothing. He might as well fight for a chance at something, even if death is likely. This conviction is why Mihawk acknowledges his swordsmanship. Rule 5 is to embrace death. Swordsmanship is about commitment. To swords, self-reliance, honor, and responsibility. But commitments aren't real if they're conditional. They're only complete if you give it your all. And the only way to do that is by surrendering your name and accepting death. Zoro tanks so many injuries because if you're ready to die, you can't be scared of getting hurt. He stabs his own wounds against Kabaji to show that. He's recognized as a true swordsman by both Ipponmatsu and Kitetsu III itself because he's willing to risk his arm against the sword. He nearly severs his legs against Mr. 3 because fighting on with injuries is better than giving up. This conviction stays firm even when victory is impossible. When Hachi's swords are broken, he starts punching. He didn't stake his life on the sword. But when Mihawk breaks Zoro's swords and Zoro recognizes that he can't win, he doesn't run away or start fighting with his fists. If you've truly stopped valuing your life, you can't take that back. Even when defeat is guaranteed, wounds on the back are a swordsman's shame. If you fear death, you'll break other rules to avoid it. Basil Hawkins breaks basically every rule, with a tricky power that dishonorably hurts other people in his stead, all because he fears death so much that he obsesses over his odds of survival. Even Brook breaks Rule 2 and lets Zoro fight Ryuma for him, because he needs to survive to reunite with Laboon. His swordsmanship conflicts with another goal. This could have happened to Zoro. He wants to be the world's strongest swordsman and to make Luffy Pirate King. But after losing to Mihawk, Zoro asks Luffy, "If I fail to become the world's greatest swordsman, you'll be disappointed, right?" What Luffy wants from Zoro is for him to achieve his dream. The two motivations fuse into one. Rather than shy away from death, Zoro is willing to die for Luffy at Thriller Bark. But while he doesn't fear death for another dream, dying for Luffy is still giving up on swordsmanship. Zoro's resolve only becomes complete in Wano. He thinks he's willing to bite King's throat out, since King isn't a swordsman. In this fight, the rules don't apply. But later on, he drops Kitetsu. He doesn't need to retrieve the sword here. It's not a sword duel, and Zoro said he's willing to use any tactic to win. He's still got teeth. But he grabs Kitetsu anyway. King mocks him for risking his life for a sword, but Zoro is choosing to stake his life on winning as a swordsman, even against an anti-swordsman, and even when everything his crew is fighting for is on the line. Zoro realizes afterwards that wielding Enma requires enough haki to kill him. The very act of wielding a sword is itself a danger to his life. And he does it. He embraces death, not against his enemy, but against his sword and his self. Because at its deepest level, to be a swordsman is to risk your life. To play the game, you need the rules, but the game is not the only reason to follow them. Some fighters love swords, some naturally believe in honor, and some want to be the best. But you don't need to follow the rules perfectly to qualify as the best. To earn the title of strongest, you only have to follow them in important matches. But the reason Zoro commits to the rules anyway is the same reason the world's strongest swordsman is someone like Mihawk. When Luffy is imprisoned in Udon, he trains in a sumo ring where leaving means death. He could win more easily without that rule, but he uses the situation to practice Ryuo. By limiting his options, he forces himself to improve at what remains. Zoro could get some easier wins by ambushing his opponents, but because he doesn't, his swordsmanship has to improve. Imagine that right before fighting Mr. 1, Zoro eats the devil fruit that lets you create rust. The new options make him stronger and make the fight trivial. Mr. 1 would have crumbled. But afterwards, this version of Zoro is weaker than the version that had to cut steel. As Mr. 1 says, Zoro got stronger as he fought. If his trickery succeeded against Bram, he wouldn't have learned flying slashes. He didn't have to wield Enma, but risking his life forced his haki to bloom. That is why swordsmen follow the rules. Adversity helps you grow, and the rules funnel adversity against your swordsmanship. If your only option is to win with swordsmanship, then your swordsmanship is gonna improve. And if it doesn't, well, you already accepted death. Kabaji probably got more wins with his trickery, but each one was a missed opportunity to become better. Zoro will still break the rules when it's obviously not a sword duel, but sometimes he'll choose to follow them anyway. He blocks a giant attack from Big Mom and Kaido to protect the others, and he does the most damage against Kaido when he approaches him solo. Zoro is strongest in a 1v1. This is part of why Zoro and Sanji are fundamentally different. Zoro's rules provide benefit, but Sanji's rules do the opposite. Not fighting with his hands, not fighting women, and feeding anyone hungry all make things harder. But Sanji believes his rules are right, and the fact that he follows them even when it's detrimental is what gives them weight. He needs to stick to them no matter what because he doesn't like the person he'd be if he was willing to compromise. His rules are meant to keep him from changing. Compared to Sanji, Zoro's rules might seem shallow. Sanji's fighting style doesn't come from playing no-hands kickboxing, it's because cooking is sacred to him. Of course he's gonna judge someone who only uses rules for personal gain. But that's not quite fair to Zoro. Zoro's commitment to self-improvement is so strong that it manifests in rules. His rules are meant to change him, to make him into the person he wants to be. And that person is Mihawk. Mihawk follows the rules perfectly, and that's what brought him where he is. The only way a swordsman can grow that strong is by being like Mihawk. Unless, that is, they have another reason to be strong. It's finally time to talk about Shanks. Way back near the start, I said that Shanks doesn't feel like a swordsman. Now we can finally examine why, and we can see if that would allow Shanks to beat Mihawk and what that tells us. Shanks seems to follow Rule 1. We've only seen him fight with a sword. But he breaks Rule 2. He lets his crew kill bandits and deal with Bartolomeo, and at Marineford he tells everyone to fight him and his crew. Now maybe that's unfair since none of those situations are duels, but if he's that willing to delegate, he doesn't seem to have a self-reliant attitude. We haven't seen him break Rule 3, but that's because we barely see him fight. Outside of combat, he's a bit of a trickster. He fools Luffy into drinking milk, and his crew makes Bartolomeo think he drank poison in an epic prank. Shanks implicitly approves of this strategy. He also tricks his ex-boyfriend into returning his hat to Luffy. I think there's enough there that his trickery could appear in combat. He's inconsistent on Rule 4. He lets Higuma smash a bottle on him and gets blinded by a smoke bomb, but he also preemptively stops Kid at Elbaf. He's hungover when meeting Mihawk, but seeing as he was down to fight, it's not my place to judge if he was too drunk. Finally, there's no evidence that Shanks will die for swordsmanship. Until shown otherwise, he does not follow Rule 5. If following the rules made Mihawk strong, then breaking them should leave Shanks weaker. Him being an emperor anyway implies he has something else going on, but we'll come back to that later. We aren't done analyzing the characters, but we have to discuss power scaling first. Despite Shanks being iffy on 4 rules and only following 1, I'd still call him a swordsman. He does have a sword. If he beat Mihawk in a straight fight, we'd call him the strongest, which still isn't an option. But of course, disqualifying him outright was never our goal, and it doesn't have to be a straight fight. Like we established early on, under the rules framework of swordsmanship, if Shanks wins by breaking the rules, he didn't win a sword duel and can't get the title. That scenario allows him to win, but doesn't contradict that Mihawk is the world's strongest swordsman. And the violations we've seen from him imply that he doesn't care about the rules. He doesn't approach life like a swordsman. He isn't self-reliant, honorable, or prideful. He was willing to have a duel if Mihawk wanted one, but he didn't push for one himself, implying that he doesn't care about proving his strength. I think that tells us that in the right circumstance, Shanks is willing to break any of the rules, and each one is a potential way for him to win. So, as a reminder, the goal is not to prove that Shanks is stronger. The goal is to show that it's possible for Shanks to beat Mihawk without contradicting Mihawk's title. To argue that the statement, Shanks cannot be stronger than Mihawk, is false. Once we answer that question, we can examine its thematic implications. But to do that, we first need to identify a believable tactic that would get Shanks a real win, yet wouldn't count as winning a sword duel. Let's define those criteria. For Shanks to be stronger, he only needs slightly winning odds. Many matchups in One Piece are almost even. When Ace and Sabo fought 50 times, Ace won 26 to 24. Let's make that 51, so there's no ties. We need a tactic that would give Shanks one extra win, such that if he would win 24 or less normally, then he's weaker either way. But if he would win 25, which is still less than half, then he would win 26 when breaking the rules. Not in those literal numbers, but in concept. We're looking for a rule-breaking tactic where if Shanks is almost as strong as Mihawk, then using it could push him over the edge. For the tactic to be believable, it has to be definite and make sense against Mihawk. We could just say that trickery would work, but if we can't name a specific trick and explain how it works, then the argument just kinda sucks. For the win to be real, it has to count as Shanks winning. Like if Shanks were to die first, but then Mihawk would die an hour later from poison, then it's at best a draw. And if he wins by teaming up with Lucky Roo and Yasop, then come on. Yeah, it breaks Rule 2, but it's just not what we're talking about. And for the tactic to legitimately disqualify Shanks, it has to make most people agree he did not win as a swordsman. If Shanks wins by pointing behind Mihawk and saying, "Hey, what's that?" and he doesn't even get the finishing blow this way but just a little extra damage to make the difference, then even though that is trickery, it's not enough for most people to disqualify him. We need a serious violation of the rules. We need something a swordsman would never do. There is a tactic that meets these criteria. Once I noticed it, it felt obvious, but I've never heard anyone mention it. I'm sure it has been said before, just probably outside of my circles. But I will analyze why it matters, and why, if Shanks uses it, he cannot be the world's strongest swordsman. Consider if at the end of a long duel, Mihawk and Shanks are exhausted and near their limits. If Mihawk drops his sword, it's over for him, or at least he has to risk his life to pick it back up. But if Shanks drops his sword, he can pull out a gun. That's all Shanks has to do. A gun would make the difference, disqualify him, and give him a real win. And he would do it, if he has the right motivation. Guns are usually useless in fights between top tiers. Mihawk casually deflects bullets, but Shanks can use a sword for most of the fight. Then when it's almost over, he can jam a gun into Mihawk's chest and fire. This might only work out in 2% of timelines, but Mihawk isn't allowed to do it, and Shanks is. That advantage can tip the odds. Shanks can't be the world's strongest swordsman this way because guns are the opposite of swords. Swordsmen rely on personal strength, but guns generate power with a chemical reaction. They fire the same no matter who pulls the trigger. Marine grunts use them because they allow the weak to beat the strong, and they're associated with dishonorable cowards. But these things betray the principles of swordsmanship. If you saw a duel where the victor shot the loser, you wouldn't call them the better swordsman. If Shanks did that, the world would not call him the strongest. They would laugh at him. But Shanks doesn't mind being laughed at. But wait a second. If guns let the weak beat the strong, and Shanks needs one to beat Mihawk, then he isn't stronger. From a swordsman's perspective, even if Shanks can win, he's still weaker. That is a valid angle. Even if you accept that Shanks could win with a gun and not count as a swordsman, you might not count him as stronger. It feels like a gimmick, not like he's actually stronger. But that conception of strength only exists because we choose to value it. In swordsmanship, the stronger fighter wins. But the thing is, strength isn't actually real. Pure muscle is real, but the question isn't if Mihawk or Shanks can bench more. The kind of strength people mean, that people use to make tier lists, is not well defined. It's like with intelligence. You can kind of measure memory, deduction, and pattern recognition, but those are very limited metrics. There's no objective way to combine them into one number. Intelligence is helpful in something like chess, but your ELO rating isn't a measure of how smart you are, it's your ability to win at chess, and only an approximation of that. And in the same way, there's no formula to combine raw strength, skill, and haki into a number. Duels don't reveal that the winner was inherently stronger. Being stronger is defined by being the winner. The rules try to make it so winning requires strength, but the way they do that can only be arbitrary. If trickery was allowed, the game would test a kind of strength that includes insight and deception. If 2v2s were allowed, it would test teamwork and synergy. If fighters had to stay inside a ring, it would test mobility less, but the ability to stand your ground more. And if you weren't allowed to use more than 2 swords, then jaw strength and neck strength would matter a lot less than they do for Zoro. There are infinite potential rule sets that are all equally valid and equally arbitrary, and which all reward similar but distinct versions of strength. Winning only proves that you're stronger at the game you're playing, and Shanks isn't playing the same game. Taking a gun to a sword fight might not be fair, but to that, let me quote Chapter 1. Fair? Stop whining, landlubbers. You're not dealing with saints here. We're pirates, and we don't play by the rules. Pirates are free. There are no rules. You can use swords, guns, powers, trickery, or technology, or just have strong friends. Mihawk says that making allies is the most dangerous ability on the sea. There's no wrong way to win. As Luffy says to Katakuri, there's no such thing as fighting dirty in a battle between pirates. Without rules to shape what is tested, the only thing that matters is winning. For pirates, that's what strength is. A pirate is strong if they're able to defeat their enemies, regardless of how they do it. One Piece doesn't have power levels. Oda put them in one time as a joke, and they didn't even include devil fruits or haki. If Shanks wins with a gun, Mihawk isn't secretly better in true strength, and even if he is, it didn't help him win, so it didn't matter. If you find this unsatisfying, if you would rather strength be real, then consider swordsmanship. The game is for people like Zoro who want proving their strength to be possible. It only has meaning within the game, but it's a meaning we choose. Nobody invented the game or wrote down the rules. They came into existence from how swordsmen choose to fight, in ways that let them prove their strength. They're arbitrary, but they're built on general consensus, that even without an objective truth, they can feel the difference between winning with strength and winning without it. In swordsmanship, being stronger is a transitive relationship. That means if Mihawk is stronger than Zoro, and Zoro is stronger than Brook, then Mihawk is stronger than Brook. We can know that for sure because swordsmanship is meant to compare strength with no variance. That's why to become the world's strongest swordsman, you don't have to beat every swordsman in the world. You only have to beat the strongest, because that implies you could beat the rest. However, for pirates, winning is not transitive. Being strong is useful, and strong swordsmen generally make for strong pirates, but the strong can get countered by trickery and weird powers can randomly get countered too. Beating someone doesn't mean you would beat everyone they beat. A fighter without haki can overpower one with haki, but the haki user can counter a Logia user who would cheese the first fighter. Winning proves that you can beat that person, but nothing more. That's why the Pirate King isn't the strongest, but the freest. This kinda undermines the basis of power scaling, but not really. This perspective on strength doesn't allow you to perfectly rank characters, but you can discuss who would win by digging into specifics. Sometimes the answer will be the character who seems weaker. And that's why it can be fun. Instead of just seeing who has the higher power level, you get to build a case with subjective evidence. As long as everyone stays civil, it's just recreational debate. Whether Shanks can be stronger depends on which kind of strength you value, and both of them are arbitrary. But one kind is better at predicting which pirate will win, and the other is better at predicting which swordsman will win. So next time you ask if Mihawk or Shanks is stronger, you should clarify if it's a duel between swordsmen or a battle between pirates. Basically, Mihawk wins if it's no items, Fox only, final destination, but Shanks may win more if it's items on, random characters, Pokefloats. Or at least it's possible. Shanks could still turn out weaker, but if he was stronger this way, it wouldn't contradict that Mihawk is the world's strongest swordsman. Of course, this is contingent on Shanks actually using a gun. There is a scenario where he would, but it wouldn't happen in a normal sword duel. We haven't seen Shanks use a gun. If he was a true swordsman who would never touch a gun, he would probably follow the rules better, but until we see it, this is conjecture. At least, unlike hockey beams, we know guns exist. Without direct evidence of Shanks using a gun, we can't argue this is the true answer to who would win. But again, we're not saying this is the answer, just that it's a possibility. A possibility that does line up with Shanks' character. There's a reason he would use a gun, and it's the same reason he's so strong despite not following the rules. Shanks is not motivated by swordsmanship. He doesn't fight to prove himself strong, but for something greater. We see it in Chapter 1. Shanks will never forgive you if you hurt his friends. He won't sacrifice his life for swordsmanship, but we saw him give up an arm for this. Shanks is a pirate first and a swordsman second, and pirates fight to be free. Freedom on the seas means having the strength to protect your friends. If firing a gun is the only way he can do so, he's shooting it. His strength might not grow from following the rules, but it will grow to beat anyone who threatens his friends. That's enough to get someone to an emperor's level. It did for Luffy. Meanwhile, Mihawk is a swordsman first and a pirate second. He doesn't have any friends, and he gave up his freedom both to become a warlord and to be Buggy's underling. But he'll beat anyone in a proper sword duel. Shanks could win this way, but the scenario is unlikely. If Mihawk approaches Shanks for a duel, Shanks has no reason to go all out. He doesn't want to kill Mihawk. He would choose to follow the rules, out of respect for his rival or curiosity about how he'd do. And Mihawk doesn't have a reason to threaten Shanks' friends. He wants to test his skills, not kill a rival crew. Against Mihawk, Shanks has no incentive to go gun mode. Maybe it could happen if Shanks had to fight the Marines like Whitebeard did, and Mihawk was on the other side. Or maybe Shanks could end up in a war against Cross Guild. Of course, in that case, he'd have to fight Mihawk's boss, and Buggy would kick his ass. But even though he might go all out against Mihawk in these scenarios, Mihawk wouldn't be at his strongest. Like Zoro, Mihawk is probably strongest in an honorable 1v1. That's the kind of fight he practices, and the kind that matters to him the most. One Piece characters are strongest when what they care about is on the line. For Shanks, that's his friends, but for Mihawk, that's proving his strength. These situations are mutually exclusive. If Shanks has a reason to use a gun, then the fight is probably not a proper duel that can prove what Mihawk wants, so Mihawk can't have as strong of a will to win. The gun thing is not the only potential solution. It's just meant to show at least one solution exists. Maybe Shanks could keep fighting with his fists, or maybe his haki is stronger when he has to protect his friends. But it's not about how he breaks the rules, it's about why they're fighting, because both fighters have optimized their strength for what they care about. We can put them in a swordsman's duel, a pirate's battle, or some other third thing, but there is no universal answer, because Shanks and Mihawk don't exist to fight each other, they exist to be fought. Their role is not as rivals, but as challenges for Luffy and Zoro. Full disclosure, I've always personally been a little bit on the Shanks side, because I think it's odd if Zoro's opponent is stronger than Luffy's. It's not a huge deal, it doesn't mean endgame Zoro is stronger than endgame Luffy, and we don't even know their final opponents yet. But I still find it odd. Luckily, the fact that strength depends on circumstances gives us a potential solution. Luffy has to fight Shanks once he's a great pirate. Out of respect for his friend, Shanks has to go all out. That's the only way he can test Luffy on the lesson he taught him, to put your life on the line. Going all out means doing everything you can to win, and against Luffy, that includes trickery. Shanks knows how gullible Luffy is. I'm not saying he's gonna fight like Foxy and dress up like a chef, but he can kick up dust, use feints, and mask his motion behind his cape. That gives an advantage against Luffy. But that won't help against Zoro, who's used to fighting tricksters. Zoro will struggle more against Mihawk, because there's no trickery to overcome, it's just a test of swordsmanship. Yet Luffy doesn't have to worry about getting fooled against Mihawk. When Mihawk swings a straight slash, Luffy can just dodge, as he did in Marineford. As simple as that. This does depend on a lot of conjecture, but if it's right, then Shanks is harder for Luffy and Mihawk is harder for Zoro. There's no issues, because opponents in One Piece aren't meant to be generically strong, they're meant to test different things. Some people suggest that Shiryu could be stronger than Mihawk, because he could be fought later. But Shiryu is the ultimate dishonorable swordsman. He ambushes with a devil fruit, and literally backstabs former allies. He can't represent the peak of swordsmanship in the way Mihawk does. But even if he's fought after Mihawk, he won't be anticlimactic, because he tests Zoro on different things. Zoro has to overcome both kinds of swordsmen. Luffy is going to be tested by both Shanks, a pirate who uses haki to protect his friends, and Blackbeard, an ambitious devil fruit collecting scoundrel. Luffy has to overcome both kinds of pirate. Similar things will likely apply to Imu and Venus Juro, assuming Luffy and Zoro fight them. For each fight, concepts are represented not just in the theming of the characters, but in the mechanics of the combat. When strength is varied and power scaling is not hierarchical, villains don't need to be a step above the last. They're strong for different reasons and in different ways. Each enemy shows what happens when you follow different ideals, and the most powerful ideals make for the hardest opponents. And that is what will lead us to the final truth about Mihawk and Shanks. One Piece is a lot of things. It's a whimsical adventure and a drama about relationships and trauma. It's a political epic about fighting oppression and a shonen about fights and power scaling. There's nothing wrong with liking one of those and ignoring the rest. Engage with the story how you want to. But people often treat the different sides as separate. The big kids put the power scaling toys away when it's time to discuss themes, as though understanding Mihawk and Shanks thematically is mutually exclusive with power scaling them. And I don't think that's accurate. Power scaling is both a natural response to how One Piece is written and a part of how it conveys its ideas. Mihawk and Shanks represent an ideal of swordsmanship and an ideal of piracy. People power scale them because they resonate with those ideals, and because One Piece uses combat to say which ideals are better than others. The narrative confirms that Luffy's ideals are better than Doflamingo's by having him win. This is woven into narrative context, as Doflamingo's ideals weren't better pre-timeskip when Luffy was weaker, and this isn't the only way One Piece conveys its themes, but it is one of them. Power scaling debates are inevitable for any story in One Piece's genre, but one of the reasons that Mihawk vs. Shanks is so contentious is that the story works this way. It's a comparison of ideals. Of course, there are weak characters with great ideals and strong characters with bad ones, but they exist in context. Mihawk and Shanks aren't just two guys, they're what Luffy and Zoro are chasing. They represent the end states of each ideal. Their strength is what following one can turn you into. Ideals are usually boring on their own. You don't want to read a story about Mihawk being perfect, you want to read about Zoro's journey to reach him. That journey is interesting because we aren't just told what principles Zoro should follow, we're shown them. The rules of swordsmanship are just words on a page. The only place they're written down is in this script, but they come to life in the choices that Zoro and his opponents make during battle, in Zoro's pain and suffering as he overcomes opponents while following rules. The physical details of his fights, the gameplay in a sense, are used to show the themes, and so is power scaling itself. How strong Mihawk is isn't just for fights and flavor. Every time Zoro struggles, improves, and wins is another rung on a ladder that Mihawk has already climbed. His strength is the character growth that Zoro needs. Power scaling is a layer of symbolic meaning, just as art, paneling, music, or general symbolism can be. Mihawk's spot on the tier list is the gap between a master and a frog in a well. You can ignore power scaling and still understand the story fine. You should look at the story from the angles you find interesting, including ones that I ignore. And of course, tribalism and power scaling has caused inexcusable amounts of toxicity online. But that doesn't change that power scaling is part of One Piece's toolbox. And just as themes can get you invested enough to power scaling can get you invested in themes. Before making this video, I wasn't a big fan of Zoro. He's okay, but I prefer Luffy and Usopp. But as my friends repeated the same tired arguments about Mihawk and Shanks, and I had just read Games Agency as Art, I started thinking. I began to study Zoro, expecting just to find rules of swordsmanship so I could make my argument about Shanks. But understanding how Zoro fights and gets stronger caused me to connect to him more. I found myself caring about how he embraces sacrifice and pain for things worth risking his life for. And I only found this because I wanted to argue that Shanks can be stronger. Of course, I can't live like Zoro. The ideals that Mihawk and Shanks represent don't apply to most of us, not directly. And in real life, might does not make right. But stories can use action as a narrative device. One Piece sweeps us into a fantasy of life and death to make us reflect on our own ideals. We don't need to be the world's strongest swordsman, but we can discipline our minds to push toward our goals. We don't need to protect our friends from enemy pirates, but we can be there for them no matter what. Or we can pick different ideals, and think about what rules and sacrifices they take. This all started with the question of whether Mihawk or Shanks is stronger, and that question doesn't have a clear answer. Mihawk is a better swordsman, that's basically narrative fact. But for the world's strongest swordsman to exist, swordsmanship needs to have rules, and Shanks might win if he's willing to break them, even if that wouldn't get him the title. But it's unclear what scenario would motivate both fighters to be at their best, and unclear what actually defines being stronger. You might consider Mihawk stronger if you share his ideals of swordsmanship, because to believe in the value of training yourself to grow stronger, you have to believe that strength is a real quality, the exact mindset that underscores power scaling. In its most extreme form, power scaling shares with swordsmanship the belief that the most valuable form of strength is one that can be ranked. That's a valid perspective, but it's not the only one. If to you, the most important kind of strength is whatever can protect your friends in a chaotic world, then you might come to a different answer. The ambiguity of the clash of ideals is represented through power scaling itself. The answer has to be ambiguous, because neither ideal can be better than the other. Swordsmanship and piracy aren't meant to be compared. They aren't opposites, they're options. They show us two paths and what it takes to walk them. Mihawk is the world's strongest swordsman because your most challenging opponent is the person you want to become. That is the truth about Mihawk and Shanks. Thank you for watching. Making this video took way more of my life than I ever really planned on, but at least it's become something I feel proud of. I know I've jumped in on a controversial topic with what might end up being controversial takes, so in addition to liking, subscribing, and checking out the Patreon, I want to hear what you think. Do my arguments make sense to you, or do they not match how you think about One Piece? How do you think Mihawk versus Shanks would go? Can you think of any more rules of swordsmanship? And do you think a similar rules-based framework could help us understand any other characters? You tell me. And again, thank you for watching.